Welcome, everyone. I see some familiar names in our Zoom attendee list today, and I'm really excited about that. We're really excited to get started this morning. So as people are joining, we want to thank you so much for joining us for part 2 of our speaker series, Voices of Sustainable Agriculture. We're really looking forward to opening up this virtual space to 3 fantastic speakers this morning. We'll be sharing some information related to their different areas of knowledge under the very broad umbrella of sustainable agriculture. This speaker series was created as part of a partnership that began back in 2019 with a training that my colleague Jamie and I hosted for farmers who wanted to implement sustainable practices on their farms. So we're really excited to be continuing that partnership and having this educational opportunity for the farmers and sustainable agriculture supporters who are joining us today. Some logistics to start off this morning. You can use the Q&A box at any point to share questions for our speakers. And also feel free to use the chat to share any comments or questions that you have as well. And we'll refer to these when we come to the Q&A part of the event and help moderate those questions for our speakers to respond. We might also have some time for speakers to share responses through the Q&A box or chat, so look for those too. If you'd like to have subtitles on during the event, there's a little CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you turn that on, you can see the subtitles or the transcript for today. We'll be recording and posting this event on our website afterwards, so please stay tuned for that. We'll make sure to send all of our registrants a link afterwards. So in a few weeks, you should have that recording right in your inbox. So for today's agenda, we're starting off by introducing ourselves, who we are, what we do. We welcome you all to share in the chat your name and your organization, where you're joining us from today. We'd love to see who's here on Zoom with us. Once we start the session and share who we are, we'll pass the mic over to our speakers. Once everyone has presented, we'll have about 20 minutes or so for Q&A. So keep your questions coming throughout our talks today, and we'll try to get to as many as possible by the end. Then we'll be closing our session and sharing a Dropbox with resources for all of you, so make sure to stick around for that. You'll be able to access the speaker presentations there, along with any resources we have shared that are related to sustainable agriculture and the topics we're covering. So a little bit about MSU Center for Regional Food Systems. We're a unit at Michigan State University that specializes in research, education, and outreach around regionally integrated sustainable food systems. We work all over the place, especially within the state of Michigan and nationally, and a bit international work. Our vision is a thriving economy, equity, and sustainability for Michigan, the country, and the planet through food systems rooted in local regions and centered on food that is healthy, green, fair, and affordable. Our values are collaboration, shared vision, place, equity, and accountability. And these 5 values drive the work that we do as we work across all different parts of the food system, from production to processing, consumption, and more, everything in between. So I'll pass the mic over to Jamie to share a little bit more about what we do in our programs. I see some people are introducing themselves. It's nice to meet you all and see you all here today.
Good morning, everyone. At the Center for Regional Food Systems, we operate in a lot of partnerships and rely on a lot of stakeholders that participate in networks. So specifically, we would have the Michigan Farm to Institution Network, where we're trying to help farmers break down any barriers to connect to buyers within institutions like schools, school districts, and hospitals. We have Racial Equity in the Food Systems work group that's active and has various webinars throughout the year that you might find of interest. And another project I'll just mention, we call it Food Spice, which is food systems partners investing in communities and entrepreneurs. This is a partnership project really specifically in the Upper Peninsula and Southwest Michigan to drive food business, farm business, and positively impact our economy. We do this through entrepreneurial support, networking events, there's a lot of opportunities for you to join too and try to build that stronger food system. We have sponsors for these events so that we are able to pay our presenters and get some robust information out there. So we would thank the Kellogg's company and Leaf Jerky, which is a vegan, I think it's like a Slim Jim, like a vegan Slim Jim. So I'm Jamie Rarig. I am a academic specialist and innovation counselor with the Center for Regional Food Systems and also the Product Center.
I'll introduce myself as well, which I haven't done yet. My name is Lindsay Mensch. I'm an outreach and communication specialist with the MSU Center for Regional Food Systems. Maria, will you go ahead?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Maria Graziani. I'm a specialist as well with an innovation counselor with the Center for Regional Food Systems and the Product Center at MSU.
So this is the second session of our series of the Voices of Sustainable Agriculture. I wanted to just mention the presenters from the first session in case you're interested in viewing the recording or seeing their slides, which are saved in this Dropbox folder we'll share with you. So in the first session, we heard from Alex Ball, who's a Michigan farmer. He owns Old City Acres Farm. And Alex talked about how he uses water management techniques on his farm to support sustainable agriculture. We also heard from Patty Martin, who's based out of Washington, and she's the co-founder and executive director of an organization called Save Our Soil. Patty's very passionate around trying to make sure that we're all aware of toxins that might exist in our fertilizers that go into our farms and food. And also she has a great story in a book if you want to look her up. And again, those slides are going to be available to you in the Dropbox folder that we'll share at the end of the session. And our first presenter today is Naim Edwards. I see a lot of familiar names on the Zoom, so I think a lot of people might already know Naim, but I'll do an introduction for those who don't. Naim directs the Michigan State University Detroit Partnership for Food Learning and Innovation. It's one of the nation's first urban agriculture centers. He works to connect people more deeply to nature through food production and land management. He holds science degrees from Morehouse College and the University of Michigan. Hopefully he still says go green since he works for Michigan State. And he volunteered with the Peace Corps in Ecuador for sustainable agriculture and natural resource conservation projects. Naim, if you're ready, I'll pass it over to you.
I'm ready. Good morning. I do say go green sometimes when the time is right. I will jump right into it to be timely and punctual, which is something that I'm working on. Good morning, everybody. I'm also going to try to share my screen. Let's see, share screen. There. All right. Presentation mode. Sweet. So if I had to title my presentation, which I did title it, I didn't have to though. It's Restoring Eden in Our Communities with Edible Forest. And I think of Eden for people who are presumably Muslim, Jewish, Christian, or whether you're of those faiths or not. Eden is a place where human civilization is believed to have begun, and it is also a place that is likened to paradise. And in Eden, human beings were essentially able to access anything and everything they could ever need, including food. And it was just a place where you didn't need money to purchase the stuff, the necessities in life. And there was also a tremendous abundance and variety of healthy things available, essentially wherever you went within arm's reach. So I'll essentially be talking about edible food forests and ways to bring these paradises into our urban, rural, suburban communities. So Of course, this is a virtual event, but I usually try to start all presentations with greetings, gratitude, and grounding. Greetings, thanks to you guys for being present on this presentation. Thanks to Center for Regional Food Systems for creating the space to have this conversation and dialogue. Thanks to God and all the human beings, ancestors who made me a person presumably worth listening to, and a person who has knowledge and tries to be constructive. And then grounding, of course, one of the reasons we are virtual is because we are living in the era of a pandemic. So just being mindful of trauma and harm and stress and all the things in our lives that keep us apart, trying to counter those with creating sustainable food systems. So this photo essentially shows the wonders and value of agriculture. It can often be a mechanism that brings people together. This is an opportunity to create and construct things collectively, which is one of the beautiful benefits, particularly within, to some degree, the urban or suburban, but certainly rural communities can have thriving, populated community gardens as well. Essentially, I'm going to address my life in Ecuador. I did Peace Corps in Ecuador from 2010 to 2012, how that shifted and essentially transformed in a lot of ways how I perceive the world and my place in it. Patterns that I began to realize and kind of things I deconstructed once returning to the United States, and then making the case for edible food forests. So this is a photo of the city, the village that I lived in called Zaruma. It's in the southern province of El Oro, on the border with Peru and Ecuador. And you can see kind of in the background that it's a pretty isolated place. You have to essentially travel a couple hours through the mountains to get there. But once you get there, it's a pretty densely populated community. And all throughout Zaruma, as dense as it is, along the streets and people's front and backyards and in city parks, there are varieties of mangoes, avocados, zapote, guanabana, banana, plantain. They had almond trees, guaya, passion fruit, like all this stuff was just like out and everywhere you went in the city. And it was just a really intriguing experience to watch people essentially leave their houses or walk outside of their houses on a daily basis and have access to like really delicious fruits and nuts. And I kind of wondered, like, how did I make it all the way to my mid-20s without seeing a place like this? Because they are relatively, if not completely devoid in the United States for the most part. Here's two photos, the photo on the left, or the young girl in the tree. Essentially, children in parks, one of the games they would play is like, who can harvest the most fruits? And that was a game that on one hand just showed kind of the abundance of fruit, that you could turn harvesting fruit into a game. And children also had the ability to recognize these plants. So they had a relationship with nature. They had a relationship with when fruits were ready, when things were ripened. And they also had an inclination and an orientation to taking advantage of these publicly available foods and then sharing them with their friends and taking stuff home to their families. So that was also something that is not normal here in the United States, where children are necessarily going out into the world and then bringing gifts home to share with one another and with their families. Certainly a natural resource. Sometimes kids bring home flowers or things like that. That's lovely, but to be able to do it with like food and say like, my parent or my guardian or someone can actually prepare something with this was an additional kind of impact. The other photo shows that abundance of fruits. There's a couple of different varieties of banana, citrus fruits, pitahaya. I see some avocados in there as well. And at farmers markets, these fruits were also depressed in prices because the people selling them understood that they were readily available in a lot of places, and they were simply making them available at the farmer's market for people who didn't necessarily have access to them. So you could buy, you know, I remember paying 25 cents for almost two full plastic bags of bananas, maybe $1.50 for like 2 pounds of mangoes. And, you know, this kind of just completely warped how I thought about accessing food. And this last photo just shows a woman who is essentially rummaging through a landfill, looking for presumably valuable plastic or metals that could be sold or recycled, but she has a bowl of like beans and rice. So that photo kind of represents, even though poverty is an issue, particularly in, you know, developing or third world countries, as they're often called, when food is available and more accessible in the landscape, food is one less thing that the poor have to worry about, although maybe their housing, their transportation, education, and all these other issues aren't necessarily solved. She had the capacity to have essentially a really healthy beans and rice, to some degree, meal. So the 3 bullet points here: when resources are abundant and accessible, when people share knowledge of how to utilize those resources, and when governments and communities prioritize the sharing of abundant resources, we can essentially end poverty. So I came back to the States, and this year in particular, 2021, I was piloting this icebreaker. And for the icebreaker, I would simply talk to a group of people and I would say, like, what do you prefer, pawpaw or persimmon? And I was struck by how often, whenever I would speak to different groups of people, most folks didn't know what either of those fruits were. So here I was kind of taking what I thought was just this novel, kind of simple icebreaker, pick one or the other. And the majority of people who participated either hadn't tried both or simply weren't familiar with either plant. And these are 2 fruits, the pawpaw plant or the persimmon, native to North America. They can be grown essentially across the entire country, but at least from the East Coast towards the Rockies, into Canada and down to Mexico. And they're not sold in stores, which is primarily the reason why people don't know what they are. And this just began to trigger my desire, similar to what I was witnessing in Ecuador, to be able to expose people to the variety and abundance of things that can be grown in our own communities. So this is a Google Earth image of my hometown. I'm from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And I grew up, I moved twice as a young person. I lived closer to the river, which was this predominantly Black, kind of middle class, lower middle class neighborhood. And then when I was 11, we moved out into the suburbs. If you can see my cursor, which was really only like 4 miles, but that's small town life for you. 4 miles to the east was the more affluent, predominantly white suburbs. And regardless of whether it was inner city or out in the suburbs, there were still no plants in the landscape that I would recognize as something that I could eat. And in this entire photo, which presumably was taken in the last year or two, I would bet that less than 0.1% of the trees inside this Google Earth image are a fruit tree. So the gradient from dense urban area out into the rural farmland and golf courses has almost no trees that a person can eat. And I simply say that to say that our civilization, our society, our culture has designed our landscapes to be devoid of plants. And we've chosen to essentially put maples and sycamores and oak trees and willows and dogwood and, you know, elm and all the other common trees we see along our streets and in our parks. And we've chosen to relegate the other trees to orchards or to just simply allow them to disappear from the landscape altogether. And that's a form of separation of how humans, particularly in the US, as well as a lot of other countries, have been intentionally separated from that connection of accessing food from the plants that the food itself comes from and from the landscapes that the food comes from. But it's all a construct. The food could still be grown in the same places, it just isn't. This, of course, is an overhead picture of an orchard. Orchards are traditionally these larger acre spaces, designed that way, presumably so that mechanized machines or humans can kind of move through the landscape efficiently and harvest all those things. And then the food is usually taken to places like these. I'm sure we're all familiar with those names and logos. But a lot of those businesses, although some of them are doing better at sourcing food locally, the majority of them, I'm sure, are perfectly content with the global supply chain and increasing food prices when things seem limited in supply, and also not necessarily intentionally supporting local food production. So that's another, I put distortion there because people have become socialized to believe that the only time I get food is when I buy it. And the only places I buy it are these large markets or potentially a local farmer's market. But the majority of the population, of course, is going to these places, which is why they're multi-billion-dollar corporations. So I did want to take a step back, if that was possible, and allow the audience, feel free to put in the chat if you can name fruits that can be grown in the state of Michigan. And I won't take too much time for that, but maybe 15 seconds. Okay, I see the number in the chat going up, but I won't check it. Some of the images here have juneberries, mulberry, thimbleberry, serviceberry, wild plum, hazelnut. All of these things can be grown in Michigan. I live in Detroit. Those things can be grown in Detroit. And I would like folks to be able to recognize and have access to those things right here or wherever they may live. So once again, Michigan is the second most agriculturally diverse state for commercial crops in the country, only after the wonderful state of California. And the bullet points are some of the plants that can be grown here in Michigan. And there are still, I'm sure, plants that I don't know that I'm hopefully going to be exposed to in the future as I intentionally cultivate this biodiversity and the landscapes that I manage and interact with. So this image is taken from the Facebook group Edible Cities, and this is essentially the vision and hope that I have for transforming our landscapes into edible forest. So whether it's on a rooftop or between homes or in a park or on our streetscapes, everything in color in that picture is essentially an edible plant, a tree, a shrub, a bush, an annual or perennial crop. There's no reason we shouldn't grow more food everywhere. Well, there are some reasons potentially, but I think there's more reasons to do it than not to do it. So edible food forests and landscapes, they add fruit and nuts. So I'm primarily, I guess, biased to fruit and nuts, simply with the understanding that there already is some normalization through community gardens and urban agriculture of annual crop production in cities and communities around the country and around the world, but it is typically annual production. So I would like to shift that narrative towards more woody fruit and nut tree production. These landscapes can feed people, reduce poverty, and create jobs. And by being more biased and prioritizing woody plants, there's a greater potential for sequestering carbon. The deep root systems of some of these plants can reduce stormwater runoff, and the size and volume of water that the plants can hold can also regulate climate and protect biodiversity. So making the case for all of these things, it's kind of a a multi-faceted or intersectional solution to a lot of issues that communities are facing today in the 21st century. We also know that with the shutdown from the pandemic, there were food shortages and runs on markets. And if communities had a higher production rate locally of food, it would have been less of, I guess, the stress and the rat race for hoarding things from the grocery stores and the markets. I wanted to tell a quick story about a woman in Detroit who was a part of a community garden, and she had her home foreclosed on, I think 3 years ago, but the people who lived in her neighborhood, who were also a part of the community garden, had the capacity to support her and staying in her home, primarily through being available with their time and energy to prevent a dumpster from being put outside of her house so that her valuables wouldn't be essentially thrown out into the dumpster in order for her to be evicted. So the owner could not get a dump truck essentially to come to the home because neighbors who she was involved in this community garden with essentially created a blockade to protect her from eviction from her property, from her home. So edible landscapes and community gardens not only are feeding people, creating jobs, but they're building strong community ties. So the resilience doesn't simply come from the health and well-being of eating better, but the social relationships and the social bonds that can be formed around maintaining these landscapes. And by alleviating the financial stress that comes from purchasing food, people also don't have to prioritize work over those relationships. And when your neighbors are threatened or your relatives are threatened, you have more capacity and time to support them because you're less dependent on a financial system and simply dependent on the collective and cooperative effort to be able to feed yourself and take care of your loved ones. 2019 to 2020, a research project was done in Detroit looking at how gardens could be used to manage stormwater. The primary or most significant takeaway, although it may have been an outlier from the project, was a rain simulation was run for 12 hours, essentially the equivalent of opening up a fire hydrant. And over the course of 12 hours, no water ran into the street or into the stormwater system because the land itself, this was an organically managed farm that had been under operation for 10 years. The soil was able to absorb all of that water. So that's, of course, across the state, there's been a lot of issues with flooding, particularly in Detroit, but a lot of urban centers have aging sewage systems. And by incorporating these crops and plants and healthier soils into our landscapes will increase the capacity for the land itself to absorb water and have less of a need to repair and replace all of the pipes that are essentially aged out simply by building up the soil and the plant's ability to hold water. There's also a workforce in place. Currently, cities and private contractors pay people to walk around with rakes and lawnmowers and leaf blowers from pretty much April to November all across Michigan. That same group of people could be paid to prune trees, to harvest vegetables, to harvest fruits, and either package those things or take them to a food pantry. So there's already kind of a workforce and a mechanism in place. And these are also individuals who presumably have an inclination to work outside and work with plants. And rather than simply use fossil fuels and kind of toil blowing leaves and cutting grass, they could do more potentially constructive and meaningful work, taking care of plants that take care of people. And I will cut it off there. Hopefully I stuck to the 15-ish minute window and allow the next speaker to go. Thank y'all.
Thank you, Naim. You can continue to put questions or responses. There's some great ones for you, Naim, in the chat box. And we will save some time at the end for questions. think next up is Maria will introduce Shiloh.
Hey everyone, I'm excited to introduce Shiloh Maples. One second, I lost my screen for a second. Okay, there we go. Shiloh is an Anishinaabe educator, community organizer, and seed keeper. She has a master's in social work from the University of Michigan, where she specialized in community organizing. She also has completed certificate programs in organic farming and sustainable community design. In her work, Shiloh recognizes the powerful potential of food systems to heal and transform both individuals and communities, and has been committed to serving food sovereignty movements, revitalizing ancestral foodways, and Indigenous community planning. Shiloh aspires to support the sovereignty of Indigenous communities, build our collective capacity, and work collaboratively in a spirit of solidarity. So everyone, Shiloh Maples.
Thank you, Maria. Hi, everyone. I'm gonna bring up some slides here. Can someone give me a thumbs up? Can you see that all right? Great, thank you. So as Maria said, my name is Shiloh Maples. I'm Anishinaabe, specifically Ojibwe and Odawa. And I am currently the program manager for an organization called Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance, which is a national nonprofit. As an organization, I'm going to use NASA short because it's kind of a long name to continue repeating. But as an organization, NASA is dedicated to restoring food systems that support Indigenous self-determination, wellness, cultures, communities, economies, and families, while rebuilding relationships with land, water, plants, and animals that sustain us. Today, I'm going to specifically talk about one of our signature programs, the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network. And I say program, but really it's more of a community of practice, a network of Indigenous seed keepers across Turtle Island, also known as North America. And so the mission of the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network is to nourish and assist the growing seed sovereignty movement across this continent. As a national network, we leverage resources and cultivate solidarity and communication within the larger matrix of regional, grassroots, tribal seed sovereignty projects. And we accomplish this mission by providing educational resources, mentorship, training, outreach and advocacy support on seed policy issues, and organizing national and regional events and convenings to connect many who are engaged in this really vital work. And we aim to create a collaborative framework for ethical seed stewardship and Indigenous seed guidelines for tribal communities to guide them as they protect their seeds from patenting and biopiracy. And the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, we kind of see it as, sometimes we use the term a shade tree, or kind of the mycelium between all of the communities that are engaged in this work, but we're really a shade tree of support to all of the regional and tribal seed initiatives. And as we offer a really diverse array of resources aimed at supporting the growing Indigenous seed movement, as a complement to the growing food sovereignty movement that's happening across Turtle Island. And so I am going to talk a little bit more specifically to, you know, sustainability in terms of like growing and saving seed. But first, I want to just touch on some of the reasons why Indigenous communities are engaged in this work. And I think it kind of speaks to how its relationship, seed keeping's relationship to social and cultural sustainability for our communities. So as Indigenous seed keepers or stewards, you know, I often think of, at least for myself, as a cultural memory keeper for my community. Part of our responsibility, like our cultural responsibility as seed keepers, is to reclaim and preserve sacred stories, cosmologies, various parts of our culture, our identity, history, and cultural wellness practices. And these are a part of our precious collective inheritance. And as seed stewards, we're helping to safeguard these for future generations, just as others did before us, for us. Now it's kind of our generation's turn to do that for the future generations. We are keeping seed and plant knowledge alive. So we're preserving our foodways, not only by saving the seeds themselves, but we're also revitalizing skills about how to grow, process, preserve, and cook these foods. As seeds change from one hand to another, community to community, Indigenous seed keepers are helping to ensure that all of the knowledge related to these foods are also being passed along as they're sharing them with each other. Some of this knowledge that we're preserving and passing down to future generation is around food processing and storage techniques. Unlike a lot of agriculture today, our ancestors planted many different varieties because each variety had its own uses, could be preserved or stored in different ways, and would do better in certain seasonal weather conditions. And so, you know, the monoculture approach is kind of, we know, is like putting all of your eggs in one basket. And so by planting multiple varieties, you know, we're increasing biodiversity, which is better for the ecosystem, but it's also helping to spread out some of that risk, especially in the time of climate change. Another reason, you know, is, you know, in our culture, all of these ancestral seed varieties have a lot of different uses, both in the way that they're cooked, but also cultural uses. So for example, if you think about all the different types of corn, there are dent corn, flour, popcorn, sweet corn varieties. These all have different uses, preservation methods, and needs in order to be cooked and processed in different ways. And seed stewards not only steward the physical seeds from one generation to the next, but also carry these cultural foodways with them. And within individual communities, seed keepers hold essential knowledge related to local traditions, practices, and protocols related to seed stewardship and culturally significant foods. We're continually engaged in deep conversations about what it means to be a seed keeper. You know, what are the responsibilities and protocols we have to uphold both to honor both the seeds and their communities of origin. And so, and lastly, you know, we know that reclaiming our foods and related practices is core to our tribal sovereignty and community well-being. And doing so helps us to mediate some of the impacts of colonization and displacement. And so you can just see from that one slide and what I shared, like this work is very complex and dynamic, but it's also a very holistic way of thinking about and relating to seed and to food work. So a little bit more about the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network. And as I'm going through this, I'm going to be sharing about our work, the work that we do as a part of our network, but I want you to be thinking about too, how this might look in your own community or cultural group. So some of the programming that we offer through the network is around mentorship and education. So we design, facilitate, implement mentorship opportunities that are really culturally appropriate. Our core services are centered on farmer education and mentorship, and we have a really strong focus on facilitating regional collaborations that uplift and empower peer-to-peer mentorship, bringing farmers together, gardeners, food and seed advocates together to share best practices. And through mentorship and education, we really aim to empower and strengthen community members' ability to not only grow seed in their communities, but also to grow the next generation of seed stewards and protectors. And so a lot of this work, we talk a lot about building seed literacy as a part of this work. This year's learning series was virtual because of COVID, like so much of our other work. But it provided opportunities for our national network to build collective capacity around seed inventory and database systems, soil health, season extension, along with many other topics. And these capacity building trainings allow us to be more equipped to care for our sacred inheritance, the seeds. And before COVID, and hopefully I'm hoping in 2022, we'll be hosting hands-on field days where in the past, those field days have been focused on hand pollination techniques, building seed screens, and operating winnowing and seed cleaning machines. Through the Indigenous seed mentorship and education, we assist in reclaiming a really critical aspect of Indigenous culture by helping communities to revitalize traditional seeds and foods. And our programming for seed stewardship is really rooted in the restoration of relationships between communities and their seeds. As Indigenous people, our identities and our cosmology, just our entire worldview is relational. And that includes our relationships with our seeds and with our foods, who we see as relatives and part of our communities. And so our programming is really meant to, as I was saying, is really rooted in the restoration of those relationships between communities and their seeds. And it's really meant to complement the community initiatives that are already happening and focus on cultural revitalization, which is really inherently a part of agricultural revitalization in our communities. In addition to our programming that goes in our different trainings that happen throughout the year, our network also supports communities in seed rematriation efforts. As communities work towards tribal food sovereignty, they're consistently looking for reconnection with culturally significant seeds. Some of these seed varieties no longer exist in their communities. There was a large push in the 20s and 30s by archaeologists, anthropologists to go into Native communities. There was a big concern of the loss of biodiversity at the time. And so these anthropologists went and took seeds and brought them back and put them in university and museum collections to try to keep records of those. But in many of the communities of origin, these seed varieties don't exist anymore. And so the seed rematriation movement is really a process that is communities can go through to be reunited with their ancestral foods and seed varieties. And so we are helping to reunite tribal communities with these seeds by facilitating intercultural collaborations with institutions, seed banks, universities, and museums. And so NAFSA has recently created a seed rematriation action guide to assist communities in beginning this intercultural dialogue. And within the next couple of weeks, that action guide will be released. Another resource that we recently put together is a seed sovereignty assessment toolkit. And the seed sovereignty assessment toolkit really looks at the functions of a seed system in communities, both the formal and informal usages of seeds. And it assesses both the availability and access to seed of adequate quality. And this approach that we're really kind of, that this toolkit is framed around is really promotes strategic thinking about the recovery, relief, and development of, as well of culturally appropriate and traditional uses of seeds. The assessment focuses on specific seed security problems that communities face, and then informs community planning and response to assist in improving access and resiliency of their local seed supply. The first major resource we rolled out from this toolkit is a community survey and a set of other tools to assist communities in conducting a seed census. And through surveys, interviews, community listening sessions, a seed census really gives a local community a better idea of what the state of seed is in their community. And the seed census process answers questions about where people are sourcing their seed from, how many people are saving seed, what seeds they have access to, what they would like access to, what supports they need, and how seed moves in and around their community. And this seed sovereignty assessment toolkit is really aimed at assisting Native communities to reclaim their local and traditional seed systems and to start rebuilding some of those. This resource is really, we hope that it will help kind of demystify the dynamic process of creating a local and culturally relevant seed project in communities. And so it's kind of like this initial information gathering process that can then inform a seed project. And this tool also empowers emerging agricultural leaders to engage their communities in necessary conversations around food and seed literacy. So they might get a sense throughout this process where they might need to do some community education. You know, maybe people don't understand yet the importance or value of saving seed in their community. And so there might have to be some community education around that. And so I'm not going to read all of these, but throughout the seed sovereignty assessment process, we're really looking to better understand like the seed resilience of a particular community. So really, what is their capacity to either maintain or increase the level of seed security? And so we've got some different areas that the toolkit really looks to examine around seed availability, seed access, varietal suitability, and seed quality. And so again, this is just will help to create a better picture about what is the state of seed in a particular community. And so we're also, as a part of this toolkit, this fall rolling out a template that communities can kind of compile their key findings into for a state of seed report for their tribal nation. And then I'm hoping to compile a regional state of seed report that kind of gives a big picture of what things look like specifically here in the upper Midwest. So just real quickly, some things that our program has on the horizon for this next year that are already in motion that we're going to continue building off of is we've received some funding that is going to allow us to begin the groundwork of establishing some seed hubs in the Northeast, Northwest, and Southwest regions. So we have a seed hub now. We actually have 3 seed hubs in the Midwest, one just north of the Twin Cities, one in Wisconsin at the Oneida Nation, and one at the Bay Mills Indian Community in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And so these seed hubs really, they're basically our community partners on the ground that we help to funnel resources to, offer capacity building support to, and where we host some of those field days and hands-on learning opportunities. So we'll, as I said, we have those 3 in the Midwest right now, and over the next year, we're going to be expanding into 3 more regions to establish seed hubs. Our network has also been discussing establishing an Indigenous seed database or catalog system Right now there aren't many places or resources that community partners can go to learn about indigenous seed varieties. Many of the existing collections are not Indigenous led, and the seed profiles in them are not reflective of our culture's relationship to seed. And some of the narratives are, at least from the community of origins perspective, are incorrect. And so I think that there's some narrative equity related to this too, and making sure that the knowledge and history tied to that particular seed is acknowledged in a good way. And so we're moving really intentionally through these conversations. We want to make sure that we center principles of Indigenous data sovereignty, and that whatever form this resource takes is respectful to the seeds and to their communities of origin. We're imagining that one function of this database will be to help reunite communities to their ancestral seeds by listing which seed collections are currently holding those varieties. So when I was talking about that seed rematriation work, communities have to approach these approach the institutions and ask if there are any of their ancestral seeds in their collection. There's no place for them to even know where those seeds exist right now. And so we're hoping that this particular resource will make it a little bit easier for our communities to start that process of seed rematriation. And we have plans. The last thing I want to share today is we have plans to conduct some feasibility studies and identify next steps in establishing an Indigenous seed cooperative model. And we're hoping that this cooperative will help to facilitate seed distribution in specific intertribal bioregions. That way, just to help foster collaboration and solidarity in the work that's happening in regions. And so that they're really focusing on regionally adapted seeds and regional seed supply, rather than trying to do this thing on a national scale, really help to support the regional work that's happening. And later next year, we hope to begin piloting a regional seed cooperative, probably here in the Midwest, that will assist communities in that inventorying of seeds and then scaling up of seed availability in the intertribal region. And I'm sharing some resources if you're interested in learning more about our work or our organization, but also some Michigan-based resources if you're interested in seed keeping, the Michigan Seed Library Network. We actually have a virtual summit on Sunday if you're interested in joining. I'll drop some info into the chat in a moment about that. And then in February, we have the annual seed swap. And then also Seed Savers Exchange, one of my favorite resources and partner organizations I do a lot of work with, but they have a lot of online free resources around seed saving. They have an annual seed school online and I think there's an in-person portion that you can attend. A citizen science program if you want to test out trials of seeds at home and kind of contribute to this body of knowledge related to specific varieties. And then they also have an online community seed network that you can join and kind of connect to other seed keepers. After we're done today, I'll also share these resources and these slides with you as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Shiloh. I love hearing the threads between your presentation and Naim's, especially thinking about how relationships are so central to everything, and whether that's a relationship to ourselves or our communities or to the land, seeds, food, all of those things feel really important in how we understand and define sustainability. So thanks so much for sharing that with us. I now have the pleasure to introduce our next speaker for today. Dr. Jenny Hodbod is joining us. Jenny is an environmental social scientist who researches social ecological resilience in food systems. She's a faculty member in the MSU Department of Community Sustainability, which is where the Center for Regional Food Systems is housed as well. So we have that connection with her. Currently, she's leading community engaged work in Michigan, exploring how to simultaneously boost rural well-being and resilience with a focus on different conduits and barriers to adoption of different management strategies that we can use in sustainable agriculture. So we will pass it over to Jenny now to
Great.
kick us off.
Okay, hopefully you can see my slides. Lindsay, does that look okay?
Yes.
Great.
Great.
Thanks, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Like Lindsay said, we have been doing a lot of work in my research group and with collaborators across CSUS and the Ag, Food and Resource Economics departments about well-being on the farm. And so today what I wanted to present was kind of an overview of how we situate well-being within conversations of sustainable ag, and also what that means for resilience of food systems. So I'm going to talk about a little bit of theory first, just so that we all kind of have a shared understanding to start from, and then go in and talk about some grazing projects that we've been applying this to in practice. So when we talk about sustainability, often a kind of frequent way of describing that is to think about kind of improving quality of life across environmental, social, and economic pillars, or kind of areas of a system would be the language I use, a farm, a business, a community as such. And we have this kind of longitudinal perspective where we want to make sure that that's for both communities in the present and communities in the future. And my way of trying to operationalize that idea of sustainability is to really think about well-being as those indicators of sustainability, from both an environmental and socioeconomic perspective, but in kind of using them as snapshots, but also thinking about them over time to be able to say, is this going to help communities in the future as well as in the present? So really kind of start with this central idea of well-being split across the three pillars, as often it's referred to, and then kind of envelop it in this idea of sustainability to think about how well-being is supported over time and the interactions between those different pillars. So often, what we have done in industrializing our food systems and in just generally kind of development across countries in the past kind of 200 years is we've often kind of used environmental resources to support economic growth. And so we need to have that conversation about, is that going to, what does that mean for future access to environmental resources, or ways that we kind of perceive of nature as just this source of resources in itself? Do we need to rethink that? The way I integrate then a resilience perspective is to think about resilience really as a property of systems that says, how can a system respond to change? So resilience in itself isn't a good or a bad thing. It's something every system has. It can be relatively high or relatively low. And really the question is the thing we're trying to protect desirable or not, right? Is it providing well-being or not? So then what resilience helps us do is say, well, if we have a sustainable system, and we want that to persevere, how do we build resilience to make sure that those different forms of well-being are supported over time? Whereas if there's a system, and like we have in many of our food systems, where we aren't providing food security for all, right? Or we have kind of forms of environmental degradation and kind of reduced environmental well-being, how do we actually use resilience ideas to create positive change and maintain a more desirable regime into the future? So this is just how I see these three concepts fitting together. They are kind of nested, and we tend to start in my research group with kind of the well-being at the core. Like, are we actually achieving the goals that we want out of our system? Then when you start to think about these things over time, as we need to, we can think about well-being as kind of occasional snapshots of sustainability. Like here I've got a label saying well-being at time one, prior to any kind of disturbance to the system. In a food system, this could be a change in prices. This could be a drought, this could be a pest coming through, etc. And what we really want our resilience to support is this continued well-being over time, right? So that's going to support our overall sustainability. And what this graph just shows is that a more resilient system will recover more quickly to kind of levels of well-being that we think are desirable than a less resilient system. The tricky thing is that assessing all of these elements really can't be done with one metric, right? We all have very different ideas about what well-being looks like, about what sustainability looks like, and therefore what resilience will look like. So what we've been doing in my group is trying to deconstruct this for farm level systems, and particularly farms that are participating in livestock systems. So in Michigan here, it's been mostly focused around cow-calf producers. And what we've done is go to the literature to find initial kind of ideas of what does well-being mean in the cow-calf system. And then we want to track what does that kind of look like over time to be able to understand ideas of sustainability and resilience as well. So the paper I'm citing here is a 2018 paper from Marchese, I'm probably pronouncing that really badly, but this is their example of looking at this for kind of national levels of sustainability. And what you can see is you've got your three kind of pillars of well-being, as it were, and then individual metrics for each of those. And then what this paper does is very subtly just say, and then we look at them all together, which is the kind of black box piece that I will not unpack too much today. But what we've done in our work is try and create the same type of idea. So what are the metrics of these different pillars of well-being that we want to study? And on the farm, what we found is that obviously soil health is something that's come up a lot, both in the first session that Lindsay and Jamie have run, and generally is a big conversation at the minute at MSU. How do we, this whole space of regenerative agriculture and improving kind of ecosystem services coming from our more ecological systems, as well as supporting socioeconomic ideas of well-being. So we know that, we need to study ideas to do with soil health, to do with the ecosystem services being supported on the farm, and in a cow-calf situation, animal health and well-being, right? Like, are the cattle actually happy and healthy? I will admit from the beginning, this is not my area of expertise, and this is why I work in big interdisciplinary teams, because I'm a social scientist, so I focus more on the next bit, which is actually the kind of often woollier part, no pun intended, but maybe I should have intended that pun. What we're looking at is really like, what does someone's quality of life look like? And so obviously in businesses to do with farming and agriculture, profit and kind of economic ideas are going to be contained within that. And you'll see at the bottom that we have, kind of relatively straightforward accounting profit embedded in our approach, but also this broader perspective on how do people value their own time, right? How do people support the farm through their own time and things that aren't paid for necessarily? What types of perceptions of financial security do people have? And then we integrate that with these more non-material forms of well-being, which are things like, how satisfied are you with your life? There's some pretty well accepted kind of tools to study that. What kind of goals do you have for your farm, and are they being met or not? And we kind of label those as subjective measures of well-being because they differ for everybody, and to be honest, they differ for different people over time. There are more kind of objective measures that we can look at to do with our psychology and how we cope with stress and our personality, the health outcomes we have. And then what's really important for people basically is the groups that we're part of and how they support our well-being. So this figure on the right shows that we have all these individual ideas of well-being, but we also need to look at the communities people are part of, who's there to offer support in times of need, who do we learn from, etc. So this becomes quite messy quite quickly, but what we do is then kind of put it all into the black box, as it were, and we integrate these different ideas, and we try and understand how then both individual kind of elements of well-being, such as social well-being, change over time, but also how they integrate and trade off with each other across the environmental, social, and economic ideas. And that's what I can begin to show you some data on from our grazing work. So this is a series about sustainable ag. One of the techniques that we've been studying for a long time in my research group is a proposed method of regenerative agriculture called adaptive multi-paddock grazing. This is a high intensity, short duration, adaptive form of rotational grazing. I've put a little link down here at the bottom because one of the joys of our project is we have a documentary maker on deck who's actually our PI from Arizona State University. And there's a really great series of 10 short documentaries about the kind of practice underlying practices and then different producers using this in different states. The idea, as this picture is trying to show, is that if you can use the livestock to support kind of soil carbon and soil health, that supports water holding capacity of the soils, which gives you tolerance to drought better. It supports better biodiversity of grass species, which supports better diversity of bugs and birds and kind of wildlife. And the hope is supports better well-being for the ranchers and the animals, and the farmers and the animals. There's a growing evidence base helped by this project that we're a part of from my colleagues on the more natural science side, that this is supporting greater ecological well-being, but very rarely have people coupled that with looking at the socioeconomic well-being benefits. And our justification for this is really that it's kind of pointless if things help, sequester carbon, if doing it either makes farmers poorer or less happy, right? We need to look at all of these three things together. So we have we are one part of a very big project, which is what this graph shows, all the different teams, and we're the kind of, one of the yellow boxes in the top right. But what we've been looking at is that first question is, does AMP grazing actually support social and economic well-being? Then we wanted to look at, are there any trade-offs between those three kind of types of well-being? Because it may well be that you have to spend more money to kind of invest in the fencing infrastructure or such to be able to do this method, and that's going to have a short-term impact on your economic well-being, for example. What does that then mean for resilience, or the kind of continuation of that well-being over time? And how do we use all of this to actually think about then, if well-being is supported, advocating for this method and trying to get people to adopt it? I will say that this is work I obviously do not do alone. It's a very complicated and complex project. So shout out to all of my colleagues across the US on this project. And that this is actually forming a new project here in Michigan. So if folks are interested in that, I will talk about more of that in the question and answers. I'm going to skip over this, but this is just to show you that this is, there's multiple different forms of data collection we do here. The initial study was in the southeast of the US and was a paired approach. So 5 different pairs of ranchers across the fence line, one with AMP and one without, or non-adopter. That means from our perspective, we have a relatively small sample. So we've done bigger surveys to kind of in those geographic areas to study some of these ideas as well. But we use a series of interviews and surveys and participatory activities to collect the data. And what we found is, like you would expect, kind of mixed. So there is actually some emerging ecological benefits that are being demonstrated by our team. One of the first papers is out about soil carbon and nitrogen. And I've put this little link here, but also the PDF is in the Dropbox. Socially, actually, again, we only had a sample of 10, right? So we're trying to expand this over a much bigger group, but everybody agrees that cow-calf production in particular isn't just a job, it's a lifestyle. And because of that, there's all of these other values that lead to kind of high life satisfaction, which go beyond just the kind of, how much money did I make from my cattle this year, basically. But what we found was that most of our producers reported high life satisfaction and ideas of subjective well-being. On the AMP side, there was a slight kind of trend towards being more satisfied with their physical health. And there was, on the relational side, kind of different involvement in groups across the adopters of AMP and folks using more conventional methods. The economic side, we really can't say anything too specific because of the small sample side. But what was interesting is that a lot of people are basically subsidizing their cow-calf enterprise by their own kind of time and working off-site. And a lot of people weren't really including that in how they understood the kind of economic well-being on farm. But the AMP farmers tended to be more optimistic in their financial outlook and tended to make more revenue off the cattle. And that was usually because costs were lower than they were for the continuous grazers or conventional grazers, because they weren't having to buy seed and fertilizer and stuff and equipment for producing hay on an annual basis as well. This graph means nothing related to my data. I want to make that clear, but this is just an idea of how we then start to integrate those ideas. What we're looking for is the biggest triangle possible, right? We really want to maximize all forms of well-being, but what's interesting is to look about the balance of well-being across. So this is work that we're still doing and trying to unpack from our data, bringing in all the ecological ideas as well. But the idea is that there's never going to be a win-win-win situation, right? You have to acknowledge that there'll be trade-offs in any decision we take. And so this helps us unpack where those trade-offs are. And then when you think about what that means for resilience, we can start to unpack, how different ideas of ecosystem services have influenced people's response to certain events like weather events, what their resource base from a more financial perspective has meant for dealing with changes in the market. And one thing we noticed in our initial data collection is that there's very different levels of comfort of risk in the AMP versus non-AMP groups. And it's partly because this is a group of first generation adopters, right? These guys are more comfortable making what seem to be slightly risky decisions about management that put them out as being different to the group, and frequently kind of making changes based on that adaptive model. Whereas the folks on the other side of the fence line tended to be a bit more risk averse, and their values were really aligned with tradition and making sure that they were doing things in the way their parents and grandparents had managed the farm in the past. I will say, having done this study through a pandemic, COVID proved quite an interesting test of resilience, because obviously everybody was affected by this shock. And so some things that we've noticed is that actually cow-calf producers were relatively isolated from impacts. There were obviously issues with processing animals, but often what that meant is just folk had to keep cattle on the farm for longer than they would have done originally. And different farmers responded to that in different ways. If you were on the AMP side, you tended to adjust your grazing rotations to keep the animals fed, whereas on the continuous side, folks had to either start using stocks of hay that they weren't anticipating using, or buying in kind of fodder sometimes. Both sides were buffered by their off-farm income and the fact that this usually wasn't the primary livelihood. And there was actually an opportunity that COVID provided to both sides, in that there was an increased interest from consumers in purchasing whole animals or kind of direct marketing. But what most people talked about actually wasn't related to the farm at all. It was that COVID interrupted their kind of social activities and who they got to see when, and that was something really important to them kind of indirectly for the farm, because it means you're not necessarily seeing the group of folks that you go for coffee with once a week to kind of share new ideas and discuss changes in prices and such. So they both turned out to be relatively resilient, but in slightly different ways, and both were relatively kind of protected in their well-being overall, thankfully. So what does this mean for moving forwards? Well, we think about well-being, like we said, as this outcome of the process of different behaviors. And we also wanted to look backwards to what drives those kind of behaviors in the first place. So we've done a lot of work on understanding people's values and motivations. And that did show that there were very different values across the two groups. Everybody generally is motivated by caring for the land, but because of different underlying values to do with risk aversion or tradition versus kind of being excited by change and wanting to experiment, led to very different outcomes for behavior. And that's something we want to unpack further in this new project in Michigan. So what we're doing there is actually, we don't know whether those differences in values evolved over time, or we're just people were born with them and that's the way it is, right? So we're going to train a group of people in AMP here in Michigan, and then compare the folk that change to groups that stay static, both on the AMP and non-AMP side. And that will allow us to study what it is about that adoption process that does change values or doesn't, basically. And those findings help us then communicate to different groups of producers about these types of sustainable ag methods in ways that would appeal to their kind of core values. So that was probably quite whistle stop, but I wanted to make sure we have some time for conversation. Generally what this is work that takes a long time to do, right? Nothing is quick in studying well-being and resilience, because you have to have this kind of framing of looking over time. So this work will be continuing for the next 5 years. And if you're interested, I would welcome kind of folks who either want to participate in the study as farmers, or if you have networks that you think we could advertise through, that would be great. We're going to start recruitment in January for the Michigan project. We are going to integrate more kind of these subjective ideas, because that might help us actually differentiate better between well-being across the groups. And I would just kind of conclude by saying that, I think an understanding of this relationship between well-being and sustainability and resilience is really important to bear in mind when we start to advocate for sustainable ag techniques, that we're keeping this holistic approach, that, it's not just the ecosystem. Obviously the ecosystem is important, but there's also people living here, right? And communities dependent on those farms. And we want to bear all of those pieces in mind. So plenty more to do, basically. Again, some acknowledgements to our funders and my colleagues, and if anyone has any questions, happy to answer them in the Q&A.
Thank you, Jenny. And I realized I forgot to share my screen when you were getting introduced, so I want to give you a minute on the screen.
Here I am. Don't worry.
I really appreciate all three of your presentations and how, in my mind, each of you is talking about well-being. We're talking about sustainable agriculture on this meeting today, Zoom today, but really it is about well-being. And the example that Naim gave about the woman who was able to keep her home, and Shiloh is doing with NASA to sustain and maintain cultural traditions. It's all about that. So thank you for doing that. Okay, before we end here and we open it up to questions, I just wanted to share with you about a couple of programs that would be specific for farmers and food businesses too. So the Michigan Good Food Fund is a loan fund where we support food and farm businesses who really are, they're talking about well-being too. They're businesses on a mission. So over the past 6 years, we've supported over 300 businesses who are looking at sustainable agriculture in their food and farm business. They're producing healthy foods and considering social, racial equity as they develop their business and really, supporting the local food economy. So if you have anybody who would like to refer to us who might need some technical assistance around getting financing, access to financing, or just getting ready, please send them our way. And I already talked a little bit about the Food Spice Project. So if you are someone in Southwest Michigan, someone in the Upper Peninsula, or a statewide organization who you want to get involved, please contact us. All right, so last but not least, we have this Dropbox folder that we're talking about. Inside the folder, you'll have information from the first session and the second session, including the presenter slides. And if Naim, Shiloh, and Jenny are willing to share their slides, we can drop them in there too. And there's a Word document that has a list with a bunch of links that would be appropriate for seed saving or organic practices that you can go into that Word doc and check it out. Say one last time to thank you to our sponsors allowing us to make this happen. And I will post the Dropbox link in the folder and pass it on to Lindsay.
Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, after this event, we'll send a quick survey out to everyone to get your ideas and thoughts about how our session went today. So with that, if anyone has any questions, I know that there's a couple, you open up the Q&A box that have already been answered, really good answers and questions here. So I recommend checking those out. But if you have any others, I think you can raise your hand as well, or you can type your question out for us.
And please let me know if that link doesn't work for everyone. I'll now try to figure out a different way to share it.
Looks like we have a question from Megan. She wrote, Jenny, have your findings on the importance of well-being in sustainable agriculture been adopted by any other programs or funders? And she's also saying this is a really important piece of our food system.
No, it's a really good point. And I would say the short answer is no, not yet. But I do think these conversations are becoming at least more common to be integrated into studies about the more ecological sides. We've seen definitely some USDA now has this big kind of sustainable ag systems funding program, which still I would say has a very kind of ecological focus, but we know of folks who are integrating social science into those projects. We've been really grateful for funding from the Sustainable Ag and Research and Education. We're in the North Central region here in Michigan, and so they've funded a couple of different projects based on this idea, and they do have a very clear kind of mission that, you know, your research and education should work across the 3 pillars of sustainability. So you have to be able to demonstrate kind of how the socioeconomic side is also coupled with the ecological side. And what's really great about SARE is obviously that they want you to integrate kind of dissemination and outreach with producers into your grants, and integrate researchers into the research where you can. So that's kind of, you know, we're able to support a series of micro grants through our project as part of this implementation process, right? And which means different producers will need different things, and we don't have to have this kind of, you all get this, right? It's like, do you need training? Do you need equipment? Like, what do you need to start you on this journey? So it's kind of slowly increasing, but I think in terms of looking at metrics and studying kind of the outcomes of different things, that part is still very vague, and there's a lot of work to be done there with folks like USDA.
We have another question from Levi. How can we ensure fed and state funding for food and farming is done in a culturally competent way and take these practices into account? So if any of you want to take a stab at that.
I would say that there are a lot of opportunities with Indigenous communities to create authentic relationships with our communities, with tribal nations, with people engaged in this work, and to create long-term positions that have real power, decision-making power, for them to be a part of those conversations, and to compensate them as well for that work. Oftentimes, a lot of, at least speaking from my own experience and what I've heard from others, is when we're asked to do these things and provide that type of feedback to programs or funders. In the past, it has been, you know, people often are asked to do it for free, and that isn't sustainable for people. That's a recipe for burnout, and it's really exploitative. And so, you know, there are also some really great examples. I'm trying to think of one off the top of my mind of like shared governance with state bodies, state departments, with tribal intertribal organizations or the tribal nations themselves. And so that's a great way to ensure that at least Indigenous nations are involved, and that voice is a part of that decision-making process.
I think, you know, I think that the approach, you know, CRFS takes with the networking approach, and that, you know, we embed in CSUS as well with a community engaged approach, becomes just really important there, right? That we build on exactly what Shiloh just said, that this is all about partnerships. This is all about doing research that's useful to different communities, and therefore needs to be done in a way that's based on trust and relationships that mean we're actually doing research that's of use, right? Rather than just research that's of use to people in a university and doesn't get used outside of that as well. So I think there is at least at the state level, a growing recognition that that takes more time, and that takes kind of, you know, networking grants to start with, right? To build those relationships, to identify kind of common interests and needs. And that's something that I think we can actually all push for in even like, you know, when I review grants, right, from other folks, it's a comment I can make, right? That when I review a grant, if this doesn't seem to be done in an engaged way, I don't see how it will be successful in the long term. And so that pushes the needle a little.
Yeah, I would agree. And I would, you know, I'm not just saying this because the MSU is hosting us today, but in my experience working with MSU's Center for Regional Food System in several capacities, like I've really seen that modeled. That's part of the reason I accepted this invitation, is because I see that with all the relationships I have with staff. And through the different projects I've been a part of, is that truly authentic relationship building and engagement, and really, I think being thoughtful about how making sure that their processes are participatory. And I think that there are a lot of other institutions and organizations that there's a lot of opportunity out there for them to adopt some of those more participatory methods.
A nice way of phrasing it.
Did you have anything you wanted to add, Naim? I saw you came off mute, but I don't want to put you on the spot.
I was just going to be word picky. The question said, how can we ensure Fed and state? And I was simply going to say we can ensure that these two entities do something that they've essentially never done or have not done consistently, which is things that are culturally competent to a culture that is not the capitalist, patriarchal, et cetera, et cetera. But what we can do is always recognize, similar to what Shiloh and Jenny already said, is building that network, local network, the grassroots thing, which is what people who have resisted oppression have always done, is essentially rely on each other and build from the ground up. And through that work, institutions change and governments change. But I wouldn't expect the federal or the state to just start doing stuff. Like the urban agriculture ordinance is a good example. That took essentially decades of work. I said urban ag ordinance, but within the USDA, there's now an Office of Urban Agriculture at the federal level. And that's kind of the result of the groundwork that was being done.
I'm not a panelist or I'm not a presenter, but I'm going to answer that question too. In my mind, when we talk about building the networks, we invite everybody. We don't exclude the agencies that we're talking about. And we invite everybody and show that it's not a us versus them. It's coming together.